All right, so we'll get started so we don't waste any more time. Make this all count. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another PMP Live. My name is Bashan. I'm part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we do begin, I have a couple quick things. The first is that I want to let everyone know that this event is in partnership with historically Black churches, specifically St. Luke's Episcopal Church, the Calvary Episcopal Church, and St. George's Episcopal Church. We also have a couple of housekeeping matters, if you would. The first is that at any time during this event, if you would like to ask a question of either one of our distinguished authors, we would ask for you to place it into the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. Additionally, you'll be able to go to the chat section at any time, and you'll be able to find a link that will take you to Politics and Prose website, where you can find a copy of The Black Church, also a copy of Professor Glaude's latest book, Begin Again. Again, we highly encourage and thank you for any patronage at this time. The Black Church. In this tender and expansive reckoning with the meaning of the Black Church in America, Professor Gates takes us on a journey spanning more than 5 centuries, from the intersection of Christianity and the transatlantic slave trade to today's political landscape. At road's end, and after Gates' distinctive meditation on the churches of his childhood, we emerge with a new understanding of the importance of African-American religion to the larger national narrative, center of resistance to slavery and white supremacy, as a magnet for political mobilization, as an incubator of musical and oratorical talent that would transform the culture, and as a crucible for working through the Black community's most critical personal and social issues. As Gates brilliantly shows, the Black church has never been only one thing. Its stories lie at the heart of the Black political struggle, and it has produced many of the Black community's most notable leaders. At the same time, some churches and denominations have eschewed political engagement and exemplified practices of exclusion and intolerance that have caused polarization and pain. Those tensions remain today as a rising generation demands freedom and dignity for all within and beyond their communities, regardless of race, sex, or gender. Still, as a source of faith and refuge, spiritual sustenance, and struggle against society's darkest forces, the Black church has been central, as this enthralling history makes vividly clear. Professor Henry Louis Gates is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University, an award-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, cultural critic, and institution builder. Professor Gates has authored or co-authored 25 books and created 21 documentary films, including Finding Your Roots. His PBS documentary series, The African Americans Many Rivers to Cross, earned an Emmy Award, a Peabody Award, and an NAACP Image Award. This series and his most recent PBS documentary series, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, were both honored with the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award. He is joined in conversation today by Professor Eddie Glaude. Eddie Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University, and he himself is the author of several books, including Begin Again, Democracy and Black, and An Uncommon Faith. Without any further ado, gentlemen, it's yours.
Thank you, Brother Bashan. I appreciate it. It is such a delight to be in conversation with you, Professor Gates.
Thank you, Professor Glaude, my man. I've been looking forward to this all day. You know, I never do 2 events in the same day, but I gave a lecture to a corporation this morning about Reconstruction, and I said, let me go wash my face, put my other suit on, get ready for Eddie.
This is great. So I'm so delighted for us to have this conversation, and I'm glad that all of you have joined us. It's so many people. I think we are over 200 folks are in the room now for us to talk about this. So I want to begin with a basic question. Given 25 books, 21 documentaries, over the course of your career, the Black church has never been an explicit subject in some ways. Why this book now? What made you turn to this subject in this moment?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have a list of projects that are on the books for PBS. one of them's on the Great Migration, which we're going to call the Great Migrations, because we're going to flip it and talk about the movement from Black people from South to North. Remember, in 1910, 90% of the Black community still lives in the former Confederacy, as you well know. But we also know that after 1970, Black people started moving back. So we're going to add that S, and also, Eddie, throw in the African migration between 1990 and 2000. More Africans migrated to the United States willingly in the decade between 1990 to 2000 than came in the entire history of the slave trade directly from Africa. And most people don't know that. Then I want to do one, well, we'll do the Harlem Renaissance as part of the Great Migration, but I always wanted to do one on the Black Civil War. Everybody knows Ken Burns did a magnificent treatment of the Civil War, but to do one from the point of view of the Black people, the Black abolitionists, the 200,000 Black men who served in the Army and Navy. No one has done that. And by the way, 3/5 of them, of that 200,000, were newly liberated, enslaved Black men who were freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation, meaning they were able to get behind Union lines. They're in the South, therefore they were free. That was a provision of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then they joined the United States Colored Troops. So there are a lot of counterintuitive things about the Civil War that I want to deal with. And another, I'm not going to give the whole list, but another was the Black church. And I decided to move the Black church up because I thought it was a time for spiritual reckoning within the African-American community and a time of transition. One of my favorite books from the Harlem Renaissance, and I know it's yours, is Cain.
Cain, yeah.
And Cain is a swan song, as Sumer put it, to a way of life that was passing. And I wanted to do not exactly a swan song, but a tribute to the history of the church, precisely at a moment when the traditional relationship of the Black community to the church was profoundly changing, with the younger generation trying to figure out what is the relevance of the Black church to them and what is their relevance to the Black church. And then the Black church, quote unquote, being challenged for its homophobia, for its sexism, particularly for its failure to succor and nourish the early victims of HIV, AIDS, and the politics of Black Lives Matter. Where's the church stand on that? Now the church has come around and stepped up in many, many ways, but it's definitely a moment of transition. And this is precisely the moment. This is the Cain moment with Toomer. It's the moment to reflect on the past and then to say, okay, I don't know what's going to be here 100 years from now, but it's going to be fundamentally different than the institution that nurtured me when I was growing up. So that's why I decided to do it. I thought the timing was good. I didn't know that the reaction, Eddie, has been, when you do something that touches the zeitgeist, that's what the PBS series and this book have done. I have never done anything that's gotten a bigger response. It's gotten our highest ratings, other than Finding Your Roots, which is in a category all by itself. The book, the first week it hit the Times bestseller list. I've gotten so many emails from people. I've gotten emails from people of your faith, of the Roman Catholic faith, saying, what about us, my man? And I've had to say, well, we couldn't deal with everything. But I did talk about the crucial role of the Roman Catholic Church in the book, but we couldn't deal with that in the film in the way that we want to. And I would like to talk to you about that. But that's what I was trying to capture. The other thing is, when you look back at the political history of Black America, there was no moment when the Black church, and let me tell everybody, by the Black church traditionally, we did not mean the Baha'i and the Jains and the members of the Roman Catholic Church. The Black church There's never been a monolith, but I wrote this down for you. The traditional 7 denominations, as you know, are the AME Church, which is the first, which is formed in 1816. Then 5 years later, 1821, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Frederick Douglass's church. Then the National Baptist Convention, 1895. Then the National Baptist Convention of America, and the Progressive National Baptist Convention, as you know, and the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. And then, of course, famously, between 1895 and 1897, the Church of God in Christ, which leads to the Azusa Street revival. That is what people mean when they traditionally say the Black church. But Black people have been worshiping God in every way possible in Africa and when we arrived in the New World. So if you name a denomination, Black people have been part of that. But the traditional Black church is comprised of those 7 denominations.
Right. Right. We don't want to conflate Black church with African-American religion.
No.
Because African-American religion is much more expansive. The Black church is a very, in some ways, a kind of Afro-Protestant affair.
Yeah.
In so many ways, as you lay it out. I
mean, the Gateses for 30 years have been Episcopalians, members of what used to be St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Cumberland, Maryland. One of my great-grandmother was one of the founders of that church. By the way, do you know why Black Episcopal Church? If you hear of a St. Philip's Church, most likely it's Black. Do you know why?
No, why?
Because in the book of Acts, Philip the evangelist meets the Ethiopian eunuch. Mm-hmm. And the Ethiopian eunuch is a treasurer for the Queen of Meroe, and her title was the Kandake. And he is traveling, and in fact, he's reading the book of Isaiah when Philip the evangelist meets him, and he tells him about Jesus, and he converts. So the blackest thing in the New Testament was when Philip meets the Ethiopian eunuch. But the Ethiopian eunuch was real. I mean, the Kandake was real. She was the Queen of Meroe. So I find that very exciting and very interesting. But for years, Eddie, I couldn't understand why all these Black Episcopal church, why all these Black churches named St. Philip? And then I go, ding, there you go. Exactly. And the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholics, unlike the Anglicans in North America, were much better. The Roman Catholics baptized Black people right away. You know, we all know about 1619, and as I've told, I've talked with Nicole Hannah-Jones and the editors of the Times and many of my friends involved with that project. People I love Nicole. 1619, of course, is when our ancestors arrived in British North America. Our ancestors arrived in Catholic Spanish America in 1526. Exactly. And the Catholics converted Black people right away, not only in North America. And not only that, the King of Congo converted to Roman Catholicism in 1491. So that when the enslaved Africans who got on the boats to come to the New World carried 2 Abrahamic religions with them. Mm-hmm. Those who came from Angola were Congolese Catholics, and many had been baptized, according to John Thornton and Linda Haywood at BU, maybe as many as 20%. But they were practicing Muslims in Senegambia. Now, Islam reached Senegambia in the 10th century, and by the 12th century, Al-Idrisi writes that everybody's a practicing Muslim. And we know from the story of Joe Ben Solomon and Bilali Muhammad, Joe Ben Solomon in Annapolis, Maryland, Bilali Muhammad on Sapelo Island, the story that I tell. And he left behind an Arabic manuscript on how to find Mecca, where to pray. And Eddie, we go into the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, and we filmed that. And there's this inscription, nobody knew what it meant. So we flew a linguist down from Harvard, and he looks at it and goes, it's Arabic. Like somebody's leaving a love letter in this Christian church. So our ancestors who got on the boat were 20% probably. Estimates range from 8% to 40%. I think that's too high. Nobody knows. Nobody was taking a census. But I think 20% is reasonable for the number who were practicing Muslims. John and Linda Thornton say 20% for Congolese Catholics. And then the others were, Yoruba religion or traditional African ancestral worship. So I write that, God had 1,000 names and and 1,000 faces for our African ancestors. And you and I were raised to not to think about the Islamic presence, right, not to think about the Roman Catholic presence, but it was there. And the Vatican recognized the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore in 1831. But on the other hand, the Jesuits were a huge corporate owner of slaves in the New World. And 4 of the 5 leading countries that dealing in the slave trade officially were Roman Catholic countries. The exception was England, which of course was Anglican. Right. So, and we also know that if enslaved people could escape from British North America across the St. Mary's River to Spanish Florida, they would be free if they pledged loyalty to the crown in Spain, converted to Roman Catholicism, and scholars disagree, but agreed to serve in the militia. And we know Fort Mose outside of St. Augustine, which was a Black city. So the Roman Catholics, unlike the Anglicans of North America, were much more open to converting and baptizing and converting Africans. And that all changed with Protestants, of course, with the Great Awakening, as you well know. And the Methodists and the Baptists said, come on home.
Right. So let me
one more thing, Eddie, though, that I only realized when I was writing the book. The reason that's important, as you know, the Great Awakening hits its peak stride, the first Great Awakening, 1750. After 59% of the Africans who came to the United States came after 1750. So by the time they got here, the Methodists and the Baptists were welcoming them into the church, though often in problematic ways, as you know, with Richard Allen Absalom Jones in St. George's Methodist Church, making them worship, sit in the back and not take communion with white people or whatever, which is finally why they broke away and formed Bethel Church, which eventually would morph into African Methodist Episcopal denomination in 1816. So the relationship between the Protestant denominations and people of African descent was enormously complicated, but the Roman Catholics were much, much better. And we've been asked to do a sequel. And I promise, I want all Roman Catholics out there to hear this. If I do a sequel, I'm going to feature Eddie Glaude talking about the Roman Catholic Church, because 5% of our people are Roman Catholics, but they are not defined in the traditional definition of the Black church.
So there's a presentist preoccupation that drives you to push up, the filming of the Black church, and that is we're in this moment of transition, and we want to look backward as we try to make sense of where we currently are and where we're going. But there's something else in the book as well, and in the film. It's a deeply personal story. And it's this moment that I remember when I was reading the manuscript that struck me. And I remember telling you that it struck me. Talk a little bit about the personal dimension of the text, a little bit about what made you decide to share the story around your mother and your prayer and your intimate relationship to the Black church in that formative moment.
Well, you know what? What he's referring to, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank everybody. I know how busy everybody is in the middle of the afternoon. I love this bookstore. Politics and Prose is one of my favorite bookstores in the country. And I'm sorry that we're not there in person, because I'd be dragging Eddie out for some Indian food over at the Bombay Club and drinking a couple bottles of wine. And we'd be talking trash. And that's half the fun of doing a lecture or a book event in person. I love the book culture in Washington. I love Washington, D.C., as a matter of fact, because where I grew up is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, near Cumberland, Maryland. That's where all the gates has been for 200 years. I did not plan to tell that story when we were filming the Black church. My producers, There were two African-American women, you know them, Stacy Holman and Shayla Harris, and Kevin Burke, Dr. Kevin Burke, who was our director of research. They said, okay, we want to go to Piedmont where you went to church. Now, I attended Walden Methodist Church, all Black church, from the time I was born until I was 14 when I switched and joined my father's church. As I said, all the Gateses were Episcopalian. And I'll tell you why. And if I forget, you remind me why I left that church, which was quite difficult for me to do. But when we got to the church, they had arranged with some of my friends and cousins back in Piedmont. You know, a lot of the people I grew up with still live there, right? Piedmont, for those of you who don't know, is an Irish-Italian paper mill town. Westvaco Paper Mill had its first mill in Luke, Maryland, just across the bridge. It's a tri-town. On one side of the Potomac is West Virginia, and there are two bridges that connect to two small towns in Maryland. Luke, Maryland's Westvaco. I mean, you could throw a stone across that part of the Potomac. And so all my friends, especially Mrs. Leola Stewart, whom I love, they kept calling and said, Skippy, as they call me still, Skippy, we've got cleaned up the church and it's all painted, and your producers want you to come. Now you have to come. And I said, well, I don't know. It's too personal. I don't want it to be about me. They go, well, later for that. It's about us, you know, and we want you to come. So on that Sunday, we drove up from Cumberland where we're staying in a hotel. And I was dreading this, man, because there's a lot of memories, right? A lot of pain. You know, my mother's story, and my mother died, and my father's, you know, they're all past now. And when I go back, it's like a lot of memories, you know, a lot of people who are gone. A lot of good memories, but sad memories. A lot of people passed on. So, and, you know, I didn't know if I wanted to deal with all that. So we go to the church. The church is packed and it's full of people I hadn't seen since I went away to Yale, man, in 1969. And I'm sitting up there, and the minister said, well, you know how Black, she was white, but you know how it happens in Black church. Well, maybe Dr. Gates would like to say a few words. And I got up there, and the whole thing you see in the film is totally spontaneous. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that I was going to say any of that stuff. And what I said was what I'll share with your audience. When I was 12 years old, 1962, it was a Sunday night, and my mother and my father were all dressed up. I was sitting on the floor watching our little 12-inch black and white television. And I knew something was wrong, and they were going to the hospital. My mother bent, crouched down, and she said, Skippy, I love you, but I'm going to die. And I'm going to the hospital. I want you to be good to your father, and you listen to him. And Eddie, this is the word. I mean, I have one brother, as you know, 5 years old, Dr. Paul Gates, and me. And I love my mother as much as, you know, I could ever love anything or anybody before I had my own children. And it was like the worst day of my life. And so they took her away. I was crying. I went upstairs and I got on my knees. And there was nothing I could do. I mean, all I could do, the only choice I had was pray. I prayed to Jesus. And I said, please don't let my mother die. Please. I was crying, and I just, if my mother does die, if you don't let her die, I'll give my life to Christ. As you know, that was the expression used when they had the call to the altar. Mm-hmm. And I cried myself to sleep. 3 days later, my mother came back from the hospital. You know, it was like a miracle. And I looked in the mirror and I went, oh my God, I've been dealing with Jesus. I don't think it's a good idea to welch on this deal. So there's so few Black people in Eastern West Virginia, not exactly a hotbed of African-American culture, right? That we had one minister for two churches, one in Piedmont, one 5 miles away in the county seat in Kaiser. And interestingly enough, schools integrated there in 1955, a year after Brown v. Board, because there were so few Black people. And there was no Martin Luther King, no Rosa Parks, you know, no protest. It just integrated. And I started first grade in 1956. I went to school with white kids for 12 years, and nobody thought very much of it. But on Saturday, the Black people in the county seat would have their service. And then Sunday, the same minister would come to Piedmont at Walden Methodist Church, and we would have 11 o'clock service. So without telling anybody, on that Saturday, I hitchhiked to Kaiser. I was 12 years old. Nobody thought about kidnapping or white race. This is like the mountains of West Virginia. You know, that's who I grew up with. People hunting and fishing, and we did too, right? I hitchhiked to Kaiser, and I went to the service. Eddie, there were about 12 people. Average age of about 80 in this service. And everybody knew me, and they couldn't figure out why I was there. And I sat there. And at the moment when the minister does the call to the altar, I stood up, and I swear, the minister said, "Oh, Skippy, the toilet is back here. You can go to the bathroom."
You're not telling me.
And I go, "No, I want to give my life to Christ." And they go, "What?" And they go, "Okay." So everybody in the church got up at the altar, and they all gathered around. It was very moving.
Wow.
And they ask you 4 or 5 questions, and you have to say I do or yes. And I cried, and they all cried, and they welcomed me into the church. Then I hitchhiked back home. So it's Saturday night. That was Saturday late in the afternoon. So Saturday night, we're watching whatever the 3 channels, whatever was on a Saturday night on ABC, NBC, or CBS, because that was it, 1962. And I decided maybe it's a good time to mention this to my parents. Well, I looked over and I said, "By the way, I joined the church today." They said, "What? You did? You did what?" And I never, ever told them why I did it.
Ever?
No, because I didn't want that on anybody else between me and Jesus. And
Wow.
my father, who was shocked, just knew I'd be an Episcopalian like he was, the true church, as he called it. And he used to say, "Not your mother's church." And my mother just looked at me, and my father said, "Well, you have to take it seriously." Now, in this Methodist church, it was more like an evangelical church. You couldn't dance. I loved to dance. I loved soul music. I loved to play cards. My family played pinochle, canasta, bid, whist, spades, hearts, poker, everything. You know, I loved cards. I couldn't go to basketball games, and I loved that. You couldn't do any of that stuff. I was too young to lust in my heart, as Jimmy Carter put it. But I wouldn't have done that. And I went to church every Sunday. I read the Bible. I sang in the choir. And that was fulfilling my obligation for Jesus letting my mother live. Now, my brother, in the meantime, goes off to dental school. And he thinks this is the craziest thing he ever heard of. So he comes home once, I'm 14 years old, and he said, I can't use the language in polite company that he used. He said, "But this S word is crazy." He said, I couldn't go to the movies. He said, "I'm going to take you to the movies." Now, I also have to say, remember how Zora Neale Hurston said that anthropology was fitting her too tight like a girdle?
Mm-hmm.
She had to take that girdle off in the spyglass of anthropology in order to understand that the folk tales that she grew up with, the stories that people told, the lies, quote unquote, that really was the stuff of anthropology. The church was fitting me too tightly, like an undersized girdle. I was worshiping with people whom I loved and who loved me, but who believed that the world was created in 7 days and there was an Adam and Eve. And Eddie, I had the same brain then as I have now. And they didn't know what an allegory was or a metaphor, or everything in the Bible was literal. And they were trying to wrap their heads around how the contradictions in the Bible. And I just, that wasn't working for me. And I didn't want to be a hypocrite. So that's why when I was 14, so my brother comes home and he said, "I'm going to take you to a movie." And I go, "No, I can't go." He said, "I'm going to take you to a new Beatles movie." And it was either A Hard Day's Night or Help, whatever came out in 64. Somebody can Google it and put it in the chat. And Eddie, he took me to a matinee, and I enjoyed it so much. And when I came out, I thought a bolt of lightning was going to come down from the sky and kill me, man. And then I said, well, time to join the Episcopal Church. And I did. And by the way, I love your book on James Baldwin, as you know. I'm on record about that. But I went to church camp in the summer of 65. I had to go confirmation lessons, and I went to church camp in August of 1965. And what was happening in August of 1965? That was Watts.
Watts, right.
And there were 100 white, how many black Episcopalians are in America, let alone how many in West Virginia, right? So it's the state diocesan church camp. And I'm there with 103 or 102 kids, 3 of us were Black. And on one Sunday, you're there for 2 weeks. All the kids would gather around the circle. And when they saw me coming, they looked up and he said, oh my God. And you knew it was some racial moment. You understand, you're the only one in the room, right? And I got in this circle and it was a headline saying Negroes riot in Watts. So Eddie, I didn't know where Watts was and I didn't know what a riot was. I didn't know if that meant Black people being killed by white people or Black people killing white. I just didn't know what it was. And that night, a very sensitive Episcopal priest from New England, Robert Smith, came to my dorm room and gave me a copy of Notes of a Native Son.
Wow.
I still have that.
Wow.
And it's the first time I read a book by a Black author, and I stayed up all night and read that book. And as you know, I'm a Baldwin man too. And I would write out, I used to keep a commonplace book, like I'm sure you did, Cornell did. And I would write out beautiful passages. And I just I transposed all of James Baldwin's sentence, which is why I can remember so many of his sentences verbatim, all of his clauses and his semicolons and his, each of us helplessly and forever contains the other, male and female, female and male, Black and white, white and Black. And then he said, we are a part of each other. And then he said, many of my countrymen find this fact exceedingly inconvenient and even unfair. And so very often do I, but none of us can do anything at all about it. James Baldwin.
Exactly.
So converting to the Episcopal Church allowed me to believe in God. And that was the summer of Is God Dead by Bishop Pike. You didn't even, my Uncle Jim told me, he used to call it your daddy's church. He said, nephew, your daddy's church, that ain't even a church. You could drink, you could play cards. You don't even have to believe in God.
So this is so important to me though, right? Because, William James describes the religious impulse as a cry for help. And he uses that as a kind of point of entry, right? And you, in telling this story, right, you deeply personalize it. You give us a sense of why the Black church is often considered the rock, right? The cornerstone of Black communities in so many ways. Now, there are also moments of transition in that story. We've already kind of alluded to the complexity, not only in the beginnings, but the complexity of the landscape from Black Muslims or Islam to, Black Catholics and the like. That movement, the shift. I know you got a film coming out on migrations, but that movement, when we decide to move, not only from, because oftentimes we think about it as from south to north, but it's also from rural to urban. Right. So people are moving from the rural countryside to Mobile, from Mobile to New Orleans, from New Orleans, right, to LA and these sorts of things.
That's how it happened first. People moved from the country, the city, and then with the Exodusters in 1879, they moved to, Arkansas and then to Kansas, and you know the story. And then they moved south to north. Yeah.
So that movement had an impact on the church, and you write about this in the book. Talk a little bit about that moment of transition, because we're on our way to the moment of transition that inspired the project as a whole. But that moment of transition in the book and how you in some ways describe that landscape that these Southern migrants enter and what happened to Black church in those contexts.
Well, there's a moment before I want to talk about, and then remind me to come back and talk about the Reverend J.M. Gates, if I forget. No relation, no relation, right? Cousin to Bill and me. The first dramatic transition was the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Because you had these denominations which had unfolded in the North, and obviously, though the first Black church is probably First African Baptist in Savannah, there weren't these Black denominations. It was under slavery, so they weren't allowed to form a denomination. But there was a major church in Charleston, which would be destroyed. It was Denmark Vesey's church. And for those of you who don't know, Denmark Vesey was an enslaved man who played the lottery, 1799, he hit the lottery and he bought his own freedom. Only in America, as Don King would say. In 1822, he's accused of plotting an insurrection. Historians debate about whether they really were plotting or not, but he and his associates were executed, and the church was completely destroyed. 1822. 1865, as soon as the Civil War was over, Richard Harvey Kane, who was an AME minister, he's in Brooklyn. And Richard Harvey Kane had been born free in Greenbrier County, now West Virginia, then Virginia. West Virginia secedes in 1863 in the middle of the war. So he's my homeboy, right? He's born 1825. Richard Harvey Kane's minister in Brooklyn. He basically, Eddie, faxes himself back to Charleston because that was ground zero for Reconstruction. A majority Black state, and just like South Carolina, Louisiana, and Mississippi were majority Black states, and Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were almost majority Black states. But Charleston was ground zero for what we would call Black power. And he rebuilds the church, which is Mother Emanuel Church. And even more poetically, he hires Denmark Vesey's son, who's an architect, to design it. Man, that's poetry right there. He starts a newspaper, and then he revitalizes the church, and then he himself runs and is elected to Congress 1872, 1876. So think of this as one of the modes of constructing the narrative I used was a triangle among these three people. So there's Richard Harvey Kane, all right? And he recognizes the power of the AME Church and the power of Charleston, and he brings back Mother Emanuel Church. Then there's Bishop Daniel Payne. Daniel Payne, Richard Harvey Kane was not made a bishop, I'm sorry, but he was a minister, but he doesn't become a bishop, he goes to Congress. Daniel Payne is born in Charleston in 1811. He was a part of the mulatto elite in Charleston called the Brown Society, right? Mm-hmm. He becomes a bishop at AME Church in 1852. He convinces the AME Church to resurrect Wilberforce University, which had gone basically bankrupt. He becomes its first president. Daniel Payne then starts proselytizing throughout the South among the formerly enslaved, who had their own ways of practicing Christianity. And so the story I love, which Evelyn Higginbotham always told in the lecture course we taught together, Daniel Payne is in this rural Black church after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And Eddie, they're doing the ring shout and the feet are shuffling on the ground. And Daniel Payne, he jumps out of the pulpit and he says, stop, you're worshiping the devil. You're worshiping the devil. You people supposed to sit in straight lines and sing out the hymnal.
Yeah.
So you can see, and you see why I'm mentioning this, the class conflict that you want me to talk about when the South comes to the North already happened when the North came back to the South after the Civil War. The third part of the triangle, again, that's how I construct that first part of the narrative, is around my man, Henry McNeil Turner. Now, Henry McNeil Turner also is born free. Remember, all three of these guys were born free. Richard Harvey Kane in Virginia, Greenbrier County, Virginia. Daniel Payne in Charleston, South Carolina, which had a big free Black community. And Henry McNeil Turner in Washington, D.C. He's born in 1834. He becomes a bishop in 1880. He's a chaplain, one of the dozen or so Black chaplains in the Civil War. Henry McNeil Turner, though, goes to Africa and to take the message of the AME church there and to build churches. He comes back and gives an address at the National Baptist Convention in 1895. And you know this speech he gave, God is a Negro. Mm-hmm. God is a Negro. And people fall out, they go, what? That's like, this brother been in the sun too long in the equator. So here we can see the tensions in those three examples. You can have a miniature, if you add Jarena Lee and Nannie Helen Burroughs, we could talk about, you could see the tensions in the Black churches, class and color. But there's also inscribed the role of politics, because everybody, unlike other Protestant denominations or Christian denominations, the Black church never was apolitical. Never, 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 never. It was born in politics. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones walk out in an act of racial protest from St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philly. Frederick Douglass, remember the AME Zion Church? You know, this myth that Frederick Douglass shows up in Nantucket Island in August 1861 at the Athenaeum and just spontaneously rises to his feet and is hired. He had been speaking for 3 years at the AME Zion Church in New Bedford, as David Blight points out. And he taught Sunday school and he attended church even when he was enslaved in Baltimore, where his wife Anna, who was free. The enslaved community could worship with the free. If you then cut to, Henry Highland Garnett, he was a Presbyterian minister. Then of the 16 Black men elected to Congress during Reconstruction, 3 were ministers. The whole of the 2,000 Black men elected or appointed to office during Reconstruction, according to Eric Foner, 243 are ministers. And take the whole concept of 40 acres and a mule. That came out of a meeting that William Tecumseh Sherman had with Garrison Fraser and 19 other Black ministers in January in Savannah. 20 ministers, and they had a stenographer there. And that's why we know we have a transcript of the meeting that was published the next day in the press. Sherman says, "What do you people want?" And the mighty Garrison Fraser, I call him, said, "We want land and we want you to leave us alone." And that's when Sherman issues Special Field Order number 15, which is translated as 40 acres and a mule. But it was to to divide up the confiscated land in the Georgia Sea Islands, which they did. And many Black people settled and worked that land until Andrew Johnson made the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, General O. Howard, in the fall of 1865, go down there and tell those people that the land that had been given to them in which they worked had to be given back. Mm-hmm. So you can see in that triangle, even Black nationalism with Henry McNeil Turner saying, God is a Negro. That's amazing. So, okay, then cut to the Great Migration. I'll give you one example of the culture clash. The same kind of, are we going to worship in ecstatic forms? Are we going to worship in staid forms? What does that imply about the status of the race, the status of the new Negro? Should we be orderly, showing white people that we can control our emotions, or our ecstatic forms of behavior, as we see break out in this miraculous way in 1906 with the Azusa Street Revival, which lasts 3 years, totally multicultural, people speaking in tongues. And it's even the New York Times writes about it, because they had white people, Hispanic people, Mexican Americans, African American. And one article talked about white women rolling around in the aisle speaking in tongues. You know that was like, people said, "Oh, we can't do that now." So the story I wrote about and I like to tell is Columbia Records. Now, when I took the history of jazz at Yale, we were taught that in 1925, Columbia Records are going bankrupt. And they engage the services of Bessie Smith, classic blues. And they're saved with the sales of Bessie Smith. That's halfway true. Bessie Smith in 1925 issues a cut, sells 21,000 copies. The Reverend J.M. Gates records a sermon called "I'm Going to Die with the Staff in My Hand." Outsold Bessie Smith 2.5 to 1. Sold over 50,000 copies. And 1 year alone, he recorded 90 sermons, man. 90 sermons. And then you had the complexity. What kind of music are we going to have? Then Thomas A. Dorsey transitions from being a blues singer and musician, 1929, over to the church, and basically invents gospel music. In 1935, he partners with Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel music, and they reinvent the genre. So that the class, I'm trying to say in a long-winded way with these examples, which I find fascinating, because this is all stuff I didn't know 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. I make films to learn about things. It's like going back to graduate school for me. Right now, I think I know a fair amount for a literary critic about Reconstruction. And right now, for someone who is not a religious scholar like you are, and I want everybody to know that when I started doing the research 3 years ago, I guess, the first book I read, and this is true, was Professor Glaude's Introduction to African-American Religion, published in the Oxford Introduction series. And it's an excellent book. I make films in order to learn about things. So we spend so much time doing research for a couple years before the film's release. Then I write the book to the film. So you can see that the book follows the structure of the film, except for that last chapter. And Eddie, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the first. I sent the manuscript hot off the press to Eddie Glaude, Cornel West, Paul Harvey, and I just waited because the last chapter is my favorite because it's experimental, it's bold, it's about the Holy Ghost and the relationship between what Du Bois called the frenzy and the trance. Du Bois said the Black church is comprised of three elements: preacher, the music, and the frenzy. And then he talks about the trance. And he said that unless you have the frenzy and engage in the trance, for many Black people, you're not really a Christian, you're not really a member. And he was talking about spirit possession, getting the Holy Ghost, and probably speaking in tongues, though he doesn't use that. He doesn't use that phrase. So I did a riff in that last chapter on the concept of the beautiful and the sublime. And I've read a lot about that because I'm really an 18th century scholar. That's what my dissertation was about. So Burke on the sublime, I had a lot of email exchanges with different scholars on Burke when I was writing it, the terror of the sublime, and then how that becomes naturalized. So it's funny, I'd start that chapter with the true story, which is how Walden Methodist Church was on the left side of Water Street, and the Holiness Church, as we called it, was on the right. And I was afraid to walk past the Holiness Church. I would cross the street, ladies and gentlemen, because I was afraid the Holy Ghost lived there and was going to snatch me and take me in, because strange sounds would be coming out of that Holiness Church. It's a love letter to the church, but also a critique of the church. I don't let the church off the hook. I critique searchingly its homophobia. I critique searchingly its sexism. And I tell the story of Jarena Lee. Jarena Lee, one of the greatest preachers probably in history, and she goes to Richard Allen and said, "I've been called to preach." He goes, "I didn't get that phone call." The phone wasn't invented. I'm being anachronistic. So what does she do? She goes to church. It's 1819. There's some boring brother up there. She stands up and takes over the church. She preaches a sermon from her seat, and the church goes crazy. And Richard Allen said, "Well, maybe I was wrong." And they let her preach. In 1833, Eddie, she preaches 138 sermons I wrote these down. I'm looking down at my notes. In 1835, because it's unbelievable, she preached 692 sermons. The church did not ordain her, Eddie, until 2016. And one of my friends was an early casualty of HIV/AIDS. He was very religious, and the church turned their back on him. It's back on him. And the church was shaky, totally shaky. The AME church itself issued a statement encouraging abstinence. Give me a break. It changed. And the AME church, Vashti McKenzie, is brilliant, became the first female bishop in the year 2000. But the church has a long way to go. One of the commentators in the series says, church is 80% women and in its congregation, and its leadership is 80% male. So it has a long way to go. But in terms of its political history, as I was saying, from the very beginning, it's been political. The abolitionist movement was full of Black ministers and Black religious people who were political. And even if you cut to the 20th century, before Martin Luther King, the face of the civil rights movement was Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a minister like his daddy of Abyssinian Baptist Church with 12,000 members. Martin Luther King was a minister. Andy Young was a minister. John Lewis was a minister. And Ralph Warnock is the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King's church. So that And when Joe Biden came into South Carolina and everybody thought he was toast, Jim Clyburn hit that magic black church button, man, and that it was like electricity. Joe Biden should go to black church every Sunday and say, thank you, Jesus. And Stacy turned Georgia using black women and the networks of the black church. So I wanted to remind people of this rich and glorious, but also vexed and complex history that produced some of our greatest writers. As you know, without the King James Bible, there is no James Baldwin.
There's no James Baldwin. Right.
Without the King James Bible, there is no Toni Morris. People went to church. The church was everything, as Oprah says. It was the birthplace and nurturing ground for our major social, cultural, educational, business, and political institutions. Our music and poetry, born there. Even people couldn't read and write. They would hear the King James Bible read, and then remember James Weldon Johnson called them, black and unknown bards. These people were geniuses, and they composed the lyrics of the spirituals, which Du Bois called the sorrow songs, Steal Away, Go Down Moses. Du Bois canonizes them in, basically he's the first canon maker in the Souls of Black Folk with a list of his favorite things. So I wanted to give the church its due at a moment when the future remains in doubt. Will the church, the other answer to your question is every summer, as you know, I go to the Vineyard. And Charlene Hunter Galt, whom, as you know, integrated the New York Times and the New Yorker. She was the second Black writer at the New York Times, the first Black writer at the New Yorker. And she and Hamilton Holmes integrated the University of Georgia. Every Sunday, she drags me to the Union Chapel in Oak Bluffs. And every Sunday, there is a different minister. And I look around that church, Eddie, and the people there, many of them are probably atheists or agnostic. They're in the Black elite, but they're working class people from the island. But most of the people who afford homes on the Vineyard or afford a rental are in the Black 1% or 5%, the talented 10. And that church rocks. And it makes me feel so good. It's like a warm blanket on a cold and frigid day. And it's that feeling that I get. I'm always late. Charlene holds my seat, but it's that feeling I get an hour and a half later. I wanted to replicate that feeling in the series and do my best to help to explain it in the book. That's why I did the series.
Well, there is a reason why the response to the film and to the book has been what it has been. I mean, this is absolutely amazing. And I want to give you a shout out because it was an amazing display of the brilliance of the scholarship in African American religious studies. Just to have all of those folks, it was like Black AAR, the Black American Academy of Religion, on full display of the documentary for over those days.
I put them on camera, man. I put them on camera and I quoted them in the book and put them in the footnotes. And I even, if you look at the footnotes, things that I was, particularly the Holy Ghost chapter, I wrote that in 48 hours. I wrote the first draft in white heat. I gave it to my wife, who is the great historian, Marielle Iglesias, who is like my toughest critic, man. If you think that this is like a praise house, you can forget it. She is one tough sister. She would say, this is bullshit. You need to, you just dash that off, man. You can like dial that in. I go, this is original. She goes, this is rubbish. And I go, you don't know what you're talking about. You're from Cuba. You're an atheist. And then you know what? I sat down and I did it again. And then I was emailing experts on the Holy Ghost and Cheryl Gilks and different people that I cite. And they were writing me back and said, look at this source, look at this source. It's great. That's why when you're really humble, I'm not like I'm a humble person, but as a scholar, you need to ask, I started with you. And then I have a whole section of my library upstairs. I'm here in the kitchen of my house here in Harvard Square. But when I'm doing a project, I clear off a section of my library and I have like 3 years ago, it was just books about Reconstruction. Then, now it was books about the Black church. And if you read those books, after a while, it becomes second nature. You can't, I'm not saying I mastered the subject, but I became pretty fluent in the subject. And also I have another advantage. I can email you or Cornell or Cheryl Jilks, and you email me back. And I can even quote you, I can say, am I understanding this correct? What am I missing? You go, no, you missed that. Go back to this. So-and-so said this before. I go, okay, thank you. It's a way of it's a communal way of learning. And it makes me feel that that's the best of our tradition, when scholars are helping another scholar and you generously cite them and thank them.
Yeah, and so we're thankful to you. I know we've gone over time. We wanted to get some questions, but we both have a hard out at 5. But I think we can get one. Do you think we can get one, Bashan? Just one question for us?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can squeeze one in. We have to keep it brief so you both can make your next appointments.
Brief?
So
brief. Black preachers can't say hello in less 20 minutes. That's one thing I learned about the Black church.
So, Bashan, one quick question and one quick answer now.
All right, apologies to everybody who doesn't get picked, but I'm going to go with Mary McKean here. And she wants to know, did anything really surprise you when you did your research for this book?
That was my question. Thank you.
The first thing was about the percentage of Muslims who were on those slave ships. That totally blew my mind. The second thing was about the Kingdom of Congo. I knew it had become Roman Catholic, but I didn't know that so many of the iron enslaved ancestors were shipped out of Congo, Angola. And I didn't realize how high the percent was of people were actually practicing Congolese Catholics as we should properly put it. The third thing was preaching on wax, as Jonathan Walton calls it. When that J.M. Gates thing, that these preachers who come from the South get to the North, recognize this new technology, and they have to, instead of a 30-minute sermon or 45-minute sermon, they have to do it under 3 minutes. That's amazing. And how these migrants not only would line up around the corner here to buy a Bessie Smith record, but they would line up around the corner to buy a sermon on wax by J.M. Gates or one of the other ministers.
Lerone Martin's brilliant book entitled "Preaching on Wax." You did a wonderful job with that in the film. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. And that was a brilliant book, and it was so valuable. I was referring to John DeWalton because I put him on camera to talk about it, and he was he was really good about it. The other thing was Nannie Helen Burroughs is one of my favorite subjects. Now, I learned about her first through Evelyn Higginbotham's book, Righteous Discontent. But Nannie Helen Burroughs in September 1900, the National Baptist Convention gave a speech called How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping. So that there was a feminist critique. The National Baptist Convention was founded in 1895. And there's a feminist critique almost from the very beginning.
Right.
Yeah, and people are pushing back. One other thing, Reverend Boyd, R.H. Boyd, who founded the Baptist Publishing Company after the National Baptist Convention in 1896, I think, founded the publishing company. But in 1908, Eddie, he founded the Negro Doll Company. The Negro Doll Company. I did not know that anybody was making black dolls at that time, and it was a branch of the Baptist Church that was trying to sell these black dolls. So 1895, you have Henry McNeil Turner saying, "You people need to wake up. God is black. Any human beings with self-respect will paint God in their own image." And then R.H. Boyd, a minister, says, not only do we need a publishing company for books, but we need black dolls so that black children can have a positive self-image. These were all things, I didn't know any of these things, and 1,001 other things I didn't know. So.
Thank you. Bashan is yours. Thank you so much, Professor Gates, for your brilliance, your wisdom, and the fact that you love us so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Glaude. Thank you for being my friend.
Oh, thank you both, Professor Gates and Professor Glaude, for this enlightening historical lesson and discussion on the Black church. Special thank you, Professor Gates, for name dropping my alma mater, Wilberforce University. And to all those in attendance, we want to thank you for tuning in to this Politics to Prose event. I want to wish you all a good day and stay well read. Have a good one. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you. God bless. See you
Bye-bye.
after COVID.
Indeed. Stay safe.
Get
everybody.
vaccinated.